Chapter 41. Lord Tyrask, Taral whispered, and he and his comrades prostrated themselves. Dane watched in horror as the hideous being entered the room. The creature did not speak, but the tendrils around its mouth twitched, and Dane could feel its satisfaction as if it were his own. Tyrask strode across the chamber to the table where Lay was bound, and began to fill the basin and the table with glowing fluids. "Lay!" Dane cried. The gaunt figure continued its preparations, adjusting the fluids in the basin and arranging crystals around Lay's body. Occasionally, it would stroke her forehead with one of the tentacles around its mouth. "Lay!" No response. Even from across the room, Dane could feel the creature's power, the mental force that was holding Lay entranced. Its presence was overwhelming. It was as if he were seeing through the thing's glowing eyes, as if he were preparing to drain Lay's very life. Dane could almost taste Lay's brain, both the delicious flesh and the far more exquisite memories within. He knew that the instant she died, her essence, her spirit, her dragon mark, all that she was, would be drawn away, captured in crystal and ready to be processed. The sensation passed, and Dane's thoughts were his own again. Taral was cackling and chittering to himself, rubbing his hands together. "Mine soon," he muttered. "Her soul, yes, mine." Curiosity overcame Dane's horror, and he spoke. "But why? Why would that monster share power with you?" Taral's eyes were mad and gleaming, and Dane wasn't sure the counselor even knew he was speaking. "Tyrask is a child of madness, an emissary of the age to come," Taral said, his eyes gleaming. "He feeds on thoughts and minds, but he is not of this world, and he cannot devour a human soul. But I have no such limitations. Tyrask will consume her flesh, but her spirit will be mine, yes." Lay moved slightly as the mind flayer caught her head with its tendrils. Dane could stand no more. "Lay!" he cried, putting every ounce of energy into his voice. "Wake up! Now!" It worked. Taral drew in a sharp breath as Lay jerked her head to the side, pulling free of the monster's grip. The creature passed, and Dane could feel its frustration. A restless mind was less savory for the devourer. Again, its thoughts flooded through his mind, and he could see Lay's face as Tyrask darted in for a second attack. "Kazazar!" Lay cried. The air rippled, and Lay vanished. Tyrask's piercing tongue whipped through empty air. The enchantment Lay had woven into her glove could only be used once, and its range was limited, but it was enough. Slipping through space and time, Lay reappeared an instant later in the dark corner of the room, standing over her pack. Surprised as he was, Taral recovered quickly, but Dane knew what enchantments Lay had prepared, and he was already in motion. Calling on every ounce of strength, he pulled himself up, straining against the chains, and lashed out with his legs, catching Taral by the throat and hurling him to the ground. "Do it!" he called to Lay. Dane's blow had stunned Taral, but only for a moment. He was already rising to his feet. Chirask spun to face them, its anger a stabbing pain in their minds, and Hugel and the others were sprinting across the hall, claws and blades glittering in the faint light. A moment was all Lay needed. Grabbing her pack, she threw open the central compartment, folding out the cloth funnel that allowed her to fit large objects into the extra-dimensional pocket. "Now!" she cried. Pierce emerged, his massive bow in hand, and loosed an arrow the moment he cleared the portal. The feral boy charging Lay fell with an arrow through his knee, but Pierce was not alone. Two smaller, warforged, swift-moving scouts with swords fused to their arms darted through the portal in his wake. Lay and Dane had found 3 of these warforged, damaged and inert in the ruins of Seer, and Lay had been carrying them with her for months. Last night, she had finally managed to get 2 of them working. They were battered and worn, and Lay's enchantments would not hold for long, but for the moment, they could fight. They charged Counselor Terral. The warped counselor was unnaturally swift and strong, but the 2 warforged were a challenge for any warrior, and being made from metal and wood, the forged were immune to Terral's paralytic venom. Terral hissed and cursed, dodging a blade and planting a powerful kick in the stomach of one of the scouts. Once the forged were released, Lay rummaged in the side pocket of the pack. Dane had worn his sword to Terral's tent, but the rest of their weapons were hidden in the magical pack, ready to be retrieved as necessary. The altered humans were the lesser threat. The deadliest foe was Chirask. Now that Lay was on her feet and fully conscious, she recognized the creature from her studies. An illithid, a mind flayer, devourer of hope. These were the commanders of the armies of Zoriat, the Plain of Madness. It was said they had come to Eberron thousands of years in the past, in an extraplanar invasion that had devastated the empires of that age. An ancient order of druids had driven them and their armies into the depths of the earth, sealing them in the caverns of Kyber. Clearly, those ancient bonds had grown weak if the mind flayers were preying on the surface once more. Although it could consume a human brain in a matter of seconds, the greatest weapon of the illithid was its telepathic power. Even as Lay was rummaging for their weapons, Chirask unleashed a devastating mental shockwave. From Hugel to Dane, the creatures in the room gasped and twitched, their minds caught in the storm of conflicting thoughts. The one-armed man next to Hugel fell to the floor, sobbing, and Hugel himself clutched at his head, his face a rictus of pain. Lay struggled with a flood of emotions. Her mind was a blur. Despair, hopelessness, and pain sought to overwhelm any sort of conscious thought, but she fought it. She clung to the memories of her companions. Jode's laughter, Dane striding through the burning field at Keldon Ridge, the calm and gentle voice of Pierce. She remembered the challenges they had faced together, the forces they had overcome, and knew she could not falter now. As suddenly as it had begun, the assault was over. The Warforged were largely unaffected by the mental assault, as was Terral. Dane had withstood the attack, but his face was pale, his eyes haunted. "Pierce!" he cried, his voice trembling. "Engage! Leader! Now!" Pierce responded instantly. Dropping his bow, he charged Chirask, drawing his long flail as he ran. The mind flayer hissed, and a bolt of pure mental force engulfed Pierce. Even the inhuman consciousness of the Warforged was not enough to shield him from its effects. But while the blow would have reduced the human to drooling catatonia, Pierce was only momentarily dazed. Within seconds he had reached Chirask, and the mind flayer barely avoided the first sweeping blow of the flail. "Dane!" Lay called. She threw his adamantine dagger through the air. It was a good throw, but he barely managed to catch it with one manacled hand. And not a moment too soon Hugel had recovered, and he leveled a sweeping blow at Dane with his own sword. Dane flung himself to the side, but he couldn't move fast enough, and the Denith blade raked his ribs. Hugel cackled. He wasn't laughing for long. Lay produced the wand she'd stolen from her cousin, and she flung a crackling bolt of energy at Hugel. But the man seemed to have eyes in the side of his head, and he moved with unnatural speed. The lightning flew over him as he ducked and spun. Righting himself, he ran for Lay. The distraction was enough. Gripping his chains with his left hand and bracing against the wall with his feet, Dane pulled himself up and lashed at the length of loose chain above his right wrist. No metal could stand against an adamantine edge, and the chain parted as if it were simple rope. Dane fell to the floor, his sore muscles causing him to cry out in pain. But there was no time to indulge the agony. Hugel had backed Lay into the corner of the room, and the wand was no match for the sword. With the length of chain dangling from his left wrist, Dane charged for Hugel. He lashed out with the chain, but his foe turned, slipping under Dane's attack with unnatural ease. "You're no match for me, Dane," Hugel said with a laugh. He spun out of the path of Dane's dagger, and for a moment Dane was looking right at the tip of Lay's wand. A second later, Hugel's blade raked across Dane's back even as he turned. "I have extra eyes inside my head. I can read your every move." "Really?" Dane caught Lay's eyes and flicked a glance toward the floor. He went on the defensive, but no matter what he did, Hugel managed to dart past his blade. It was as if Hugel's sword was made of mist. Every time he tried to parry, Hugel slipped around or over his blade, drawing another tiny cut. None of the blows were severe, but the pain and blood loss were beginning to take their toll. Lay had already pulled the darkwood staff from the pack, and as Hugel made another lunge at Dane, she grabbed the staff and made a spinning strike at Hugel's knees. Once again he reacted with inhuman reflexes, leaping to avoid a blow he shouldn't even have seen. But a moment's distraction was all Dane needed. A shining arc of dark adamantine cut through the air, and Hugel was left with a hilt and an inch of blade. "Won't your friend have something to say about that?" Lay asked Dane as she struck at Hugel's legs. "I never needed a dragon-marked sword," Dane replied. "How do you want to end this, Hugel?" "I've got a few ideas," Hugel said. He moved in a blur. Catching Dane off guard, he flung the useless hilt at Dane's face, then sent him tumbling to the ground with a swift, sweeping kick. Continuing the same motion, he spun to face Lay, catching the staff in both hands. He raised his foot to kick her in the stomach, and then he screamed. Black thorns had grown out of the shaft of the staff, and they pierced right through his hands. The twisted thorns pinned his hands to the staff, and the agony seemed to be precluding any conscious thought. He and Lay struggled over the staff, but Lay could shift her grip for superior leverage, and Hugel was weakened by pain, blood flowing from his pierced palms. He whimpered, but still refused to surrender. Dane snatched up the dagger. For a moment he hesitated. He had never liked stabbing a man in the back, but he had been a soldier for 6 years, and a swordsman for many more, and he was covered in his own blood. This had to end now. He planted the point of his dagger in the back of Hugel's neck and leaned in, putting his full weight behind it. With barely a cry, Hugel collapsed to the floor. His dead weight almost pulled the staff from Lay's hands, but the black thorns vanished, and the staff slipped free. Even as Dane caught his breath, a crash came from behind him, and an armored arm skidded along the floor. He turned to see Taral surrounded by the wreckage of the 2 scouts. The counselor's robe was slashed and torn, and he was covered with bloody gashes. Despite his injuries, he faced Dane and lay without fear. "You can put an end to this, Tyral," Dane said. He crouched and prepared for the attack, slowly spinning the chain attached to his left wrist. Lay was whispering behind him, and he knew that she needed time to complete whatever enchantment she was weaving. "I intend to," Tyral hissed and licked at a wide gash that split the back of one of his hands. "Your blades have no power over me." Indeed, as Dane watched, he saw that the wounds in Tyral's fleshy armor were slowly healing. "I'm impressed," Dane said. "Does that work with a severed head?" Tyral sneered. "What are you fighting for, Dane? You have no country. All that you have worked for has been destroyed. Join us. Let the world share that pain." He moved closer, and a fleshy tentacle drifted out from under his left sleeve and coiled above his hand, a blind cobra waiting to strike. "You're right," Dane said. "My home has been destroyed, but that's not all I have. I still have friends, and you took one from me." He rushed forward, and a lightning-swift slash with his dagger severed the hovering tentacle. Tyral howled with rage, but even as Dane braced for the attack, Lay was moving. Her staff lashed out, catching Tyral dead in the chest. The counselor stopped in his tracks, screaming in pain. To Dane's astonishment, he saw that Tyral's unnatural armor had pulled back from the point of Lay's blow. "Come on!" she cried. They charged. Tyral had regained his balance. Moving inhumanly fast, he snatched up the leg of one of the shattered Forge scouts and flung it at Lay. It caught her full in the chest, and she fell. Dane kept moving, and with one smooth motion he struck the bare patch in Tyral's armor. There was a slight resistance as the dagger pierced flesh, scraped between the ribs, then it slid in the counselor's chest, all the way up to the hilt. Tyral howled. He grabbed Dane by the throat and lifted him off of the ground. Tyral howled. He grabbed Dane by the throat and lifted him off of the ground. Blood was streaming from Tyral's mouth and down his chest, but his strength was inhuman. His hand was crushing Dane's throat. The world began to fade, and then Tyral's head exploded. Pierce had come up behind Tyral and brought the full force of his flail on the counselor's skull. Tyral instantly turned to dead weight, dragging Dane to the ground. Even in death, his grip was strong, and Dane struggled to pry the grasping fingers from his throat. "Pierce!" he gasped. For a moment, relief washed over him. Then he realized Chirask was nowhere to be seen. With one curt kick, Pierce knocked Tyral's body aside, then planted his steel foot on Dane's chest, slamming him back to the ground. Without a word, Pierce raised his flail for another killing blow. Chapter 42. Lay groaned. The coppery taste of blood filled her mouth, and her head was a throbbing anvil. Gripping the staff, she forced herself to her feet, trying to ignore the pain in her ribs. She found her footing just in time to see Pierce shatter Tyral's skull. But as she moved forward, Pierce knocked Dane to the ground and pulled back for a second swing. It was clear to her in an instant. As difficult as it was to influence the thoughts of a Warforged, it was not impossible. Chirask must have found a way to twist Pierce's perceptions. Pierce had struck Tyral first, and Lay surmised he was seeing everyone as enemies. If so, she prayed she was right. At least Pierce wasn't under Chirask's direct control. If that were the case, she knew beyond doubt that she and Dane were both dead. Lei lunged forward and put her hand on his chest. She concentrated, and time seemed to stand still. Pierce became the center of all her senses, the rest of the world fading away as his binding web of energy came into view. She sharpened her focus, trying to find some way to sense what Chirask had done, to break his mental hold. Her talent was with mending metal and stone, not thought and spirit, but her desperation drove her to act on pure instinct, and she pushed deeper and deeper. But there was nothing to be done, and for all that time seemed frozen, she knew that she only had moments to act. Filled with remorse, she hardened her thoughts and struck at the heart of the web, the light that gave Pierce life, and her world exploded. For a moment, she thought she had gone mad. Pierce's life web had replicated, and she was looking at 4 different variations of the same pattern. Then she realized that changes were being made, that someone else was thinking with her mind and making minor adjustments to each of the 4 webs, discussing the shifts with another whose thoughts she couldn't feel. She couldn't hold on to any of the words. It was as if she forgot them the moment she heard them. But there was a sense of self, a recognition, and she realized these were the thoughts of her mother, preserved in the very essence of Pierce since the moment of his creation. In that instant, that mere fraction of an indrawn breath, she knew what Pierce had been built for, and just as suddenly, she was back in the material world, falling to her knees. Pierce stood stock still for a second, wavered, then collapsed. Lay wretched, both from the pain in her ribs and head and the horrible ache in her mind. The memories were already fading, and she could no longer remember exactly what it was she had seen. But she knew that her parents had built Pierce the same year that she was born, and looking down at the fallen Warforged, she wondered if she had killed her brother. Dane struggled to his feet. Lay was looking down at Pierce's inert form. "Is he dead?" he said, reaching out and putting his hand on her shoulder. "I don't know." Lay wiped at her face, brushing aside the mingled blood, tears, and bile. I tried to destroy him. I had to. But something happened." Her words were lost in a new round of tears. Dane didn't know what she was dealing with, but he didn't have the time to find out. "Lay, we need to keep moving. That thing, Chirask, it must have fled while we were fighting Taral. We need to find it. We have to finish this. If Taral was telling the truth, there are dozens of those warped warriors up above. We need to destroy Chirask before it can reach them. Otherwise, all of this, Pierce, Jode, it's been for nothing." Lay had a gift for turning grief into anger, and it came to her aid now. In her mind, she saw the monster leaning over her, its piercing tongue descending to devour her brain. She imagined Jode suffering the same treatment, and fire burned in her blood. She blinked away her tears and nodded. Dane led the way. He was weak from loss of blood, but he ran as fast as he could. Before long, they emerged from the long room. Identical hallways stretched left and right. "Which way?" Lay said. Pierce had always been the tracker for the unit, but Dane had had to hone his senses in his first career. "There," he said, pointing. A few patches of green-black blood could be seen along the floor to the left. "It looks like Pierce managed to get in a few good blows before Chirask overwhelmed him. They ran down the dark corridor. The cold fire torches were few and far between, and the air was damp and cold. The hall twisted and turned. It was ideally suited to an ambush, so Dane was hardly surprised when one finally came. Dane turned a corner and found two Syrian refugees, a half-elf woman and a scarred elderly man waiting for them. The moment Dane came into view, the woman began to sing. Her voice was the sweetest sound Dane had ever heard, a music beyond mere words. For a moment he forgot the devourer of minds, Terral, the old man. The world vanished in the purity of the sound. But a moment later, the sound came to an abrupt end. Just as the old man was leaping at Dane, a mouthful of needle teeth descended towards Dane's throat. Instinct was all that saved him. He sidestepped the attack and planted his dagger between his enemy's ribs. The warped man hissed, clawing at Dane, but he did not possess the vitality of Terral, and a moment later he collapsed to the floor. Pulling his dagger free, Dane found Lay in battle with the woman. Even as he turned to face them, Lay delivered a powerful blow to the throat, and the half-elf fell. "Harpy's voice," Lay said, looking at the unconscious woman. "Lead on." They passed a few open portals, but the trail of inhuman blood continued on down the hall. Through the open arches, Dane caught a glimpse of the room filled with stone slabs. A barracks? Crypt? At last, the hall came to an end. Stepping into the final chamber, Dane had to catch his breath. A labyrinth of steel catwalks was suspended above pools of glowing fluids, a kaleidoscope of colors and scents. A hot wave of air washed over Dane as he stepped onto the catwalk, and the sweet, cloying scent filled him with dizziness. He almost lost his balance, but he managed to pull himself together just in time. The catwalks were barely 3 feet across, and there was no railing. Any loss of composure would result in a fall into the churning reservoir that lay below. Dane took the lead, and the two of them slowly walked down the first catwalk. There were no torches in the chamber, and the only light came from the bubbling pools 30 feet below. Dane couldn't see any sight of Chirask, but there was a patch of oily green blood on the catwalk ahead. As far as he could tell, there were no other exits from the room. "Lay, what do you make of this?" he whispered. As his eyes adjusted to the light, he could see that there were a series of chains and pulleys fixed to the ceiling. Some of these were supporting the catwalks, but others descended into the pools below. Lay peered over the edge, studying one of the pools. "I think it's some sort of incubator. Look where the chain is touching the surface. There's some sort of casket down there. I think that people have been lowered into these pools." "But why?" "Think about it. Terral and his followers had those things grafted to their bodies. We know that it's something they were continuing to do here. The container at the end of that chain may hold some sort of creature waiting to be grafted to a human host. Or it may be the human subject, recovering from the experience." "Well, that's great," Dane said. "So each of these chains is attached to a monster to be. What do we do about that?"
"Cut the chains?"
"I suppose there's not much choice." Dane looked down at the catwalk, studying the way the steel segments were joined together. He felt a growing sense of satisfaction. Just a few more steps. "Lay, move!" he cried, charging forward and shoving her with all his might. Caught completely by surprise, she tumbled forward. Nearing the edge of a catwalk, she managed to stop her movement by plunging her staff through a gap in the floor of the platform.
The lure,
She swore.
what do you think?
A tremendous crash struck behind her, and she spun around. The catwalk that they'd been standing on a moment earlier had dropped to the floor of the chamber. The suspending chains had come undone, and Dane had barely pushed them onto the next segment in time. "Chirask is here," Dane said. "I can feel him." Lay studied the supporting chains and drew the lightning wand.
I think this platform is stable, but now we're cut off from the exit.
Dane watched the shadows. He could feel a presence, a gloating thought in the back of his mind. "Two have no hope," he thought. "Best to end it quickly." They were his thoughts, pure and natural, and for a moment he shifted his balance and prepared to throw himself off to the floor. Only Lay stopped him, holding him back with the darkwood staff.
Dane, what are you doing?
I don't know. It was, over there." Chirask stepped out from the shadows. Its slick skin glistened in the light of the pools, its golden eyes gleaming in the shadows. Chirask was less than 30 feet away, but it was on a different catwalk, and at a quick glance it was impossible to see how to reach it. It raised a hand in their direction. "Fall and be done." Once again Dane was caught in a storm of savage thoughts, a mental tumult that drowned out all conscious reasoning. He staggered in the wake of the mental blast. Then the pain was gone. There was a sound, faint but clear, that seemed to surround him and drive the madness away. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Lay's staff was singing. The tiny dark wood face was fully animated. Its voice was faint but clear. Dane could feel Chirask's fury, and again the storm of chaotic thoughts lashed, only to scatter against the barrier of song. Dane glanced at Lay, but she seemed as surprised as he was. Dane didn't like the darkwood staff. There was too much they didn't know about it. The Sphinx had wanted Lay to have it, but it still seemed possible that Flamewind had sent Jode to his death, or at least sent him on the path that killed him. And when it had sprouted thorns to catch Hugo's hands, what was it? What did it want? It was too dangerous. He needed to get rid of it. He'd find a way to deal with the Mind Flayer, but he needed to be able to trust the people at his side. How could he know that this thing wasn't manipulating Lay's mind? He still had the long chain attached to his wrist, and he lashed out with it. Lay was just as surprised as Dane when her staff began to sing. It was clear that it had hidden powers, but with the chaos of the last few days she hadn't had time to study it properly. Was it actually sentient? As expressive as the tiny face was, it was entirely possible that the powers of the staff were triggered by certain events. The song seemed to be shielding both of them from Chirask's attack, but for how long? Lay knew she had to act.
What do we do?
She asked. She glanced over at Dane and jerked back just in time to avoid the blow of the chain. Dropping the wand, she took up a defensive posture.
What are you doing?
"Get rid of that staff, Lay," Dane said, moving toward her. She stepped back, but there was little room to maneuver on the narrow catwalk. "Throw it over the edge. It's done something to you. And we can't take any chances."
Don't be ridiculous. It's the only reason we're still standing.
"It's manipulating you, Lay. If you won't get rid of it, I will." Dane lashed out again. Lay managed to turn the edge of the blade with the staff, but Dane's dagger drew a long furrow against the shaft. For a moment, the song took on a pained note. It's Chirask, they realized. The Mind Flayer was standing unmoving on the catwalk across the chamber. Chirask must be amplifying Dane's fears and suspicions and using them to control him. If I drop the staff, we're both defenseless.
Dane, stop! What happens once the staff is destroyed?
Dane was still weak from his injuries, and that was the only reason she'd been able to avoid his attacks as long as she had. But now, he was moving in, trying to grab the staff with his free hand, and she was running out of room to retreat. Calling on desperate reserves of willpower, Lei reached out with her mind. Her armor was a family heirloom designed to hold temporary enchantments. While it normally took a significant period of time to weave an enchantment, she could weave minor effects into her armor swiftly, though it was just as much of a drain on her energy as crafting a longer, more powerful enchantment. As Dane came forward, she whispered a word of power and leaped forward. The golden studs of her armor seemed to pull her into the air. It wasn't full flight, but she could ignore much of the pull of gravity, and she sailed over Dane's head. She landed on the platform behind him. Turning around, she gave him a quick shove with the staff. He staggered and almost tumbled off the edge of the platform. "Damn it, Lei! Are you trying to kill me?" Dane cried. He spun around, and now there was real fury in his eyes.
What can I do? She thought.
In his weakened condition, it was possible that she could knock Dane off the catwalk. But then what? But if she let Dane destroy the staff, they'd both be helpless. Dane charged again. Lei leaped a second time, but she had underestimated him. This time, he was ready for her, and as Lei sailed overhead, his chain wrapped around her ankle and she landed hard, barely staying atop the catwalk. Dane faced her, and his expression was grim. "No more running, Lei. Can't you see what it's done to your mind? Or is it too late to save you?" He paused for a moment as if listening to inner voices. "Either you throw the staff below, or I'll have to kill you. It's the only way. The only way to be sure. It's for your own good." She could hear the uncertainty in Dane's voice, but clearly Chirask's desires were worming their way to the foreground. He was shifting his weight, preparing to charge, and this time he would probably kill her. Lei didn't think her injured leg would take the strain of another jump, but Dane was still off balance himself. If she timed it right, she might be able to trip him as he approached. He would certainly fall into the toxic fluid below, but she would live, and she'd still have the staff to protect her. But she couldn't do it. She'd already sacrificed Pierce. She couldn't hurt Dane, no matter the cost. She closed her eyes and waited for the blow to fall. Even as Dane began his charge, there was a blur of motion at the entrance of the chamber, a massive steel shadow emerging into the light. Pierce raised his bow, drew the string back, and loosed. There was the whisper of an arrow in flight, and Chirask cried out, a weird, ululating wail. Dane froze, confused, as the Mind Flayer's mental focus faltered. Had he really been about to attack Lei? Pierce continued loosing, smooth and deadly. Arrow after arrow slammed into Chirask, and Dane could feel its fury. It lashed out with its thoughts, trying to crush Pierce's mind once and for all. But the Warforged fought with stoic determination. The next arrow pierced one of Chirask's gold-flecked eyes. There was a terrible cry, a burst of pure pain that threatened to split Dane's head, and then Chirask tumbled from the catwalk, disappearing into the vat of bubbling vitriol that lay far below. Lei and Dane pierced down, looking for any sign of movement, but aside from a brief trail of blood, which quickly faded, there was nothing. Chirask was gone. Dane knelt beside Lei and held her tightly. Her leg was still bleeding, and she winced in pain, but she smiled. "Pierce," she whispered. "Pierce!" Dane called. "Are you all right?" "I am functional, though damaged," Pierce replied as he approached them. "I remember little after I first engaged that creature. You arrived just in time, and that's all that matters. No, said Pierce. There is more, I believe. While I was incapacitated, I believe I had a dream.
Dream?
Lay said weakly. She had pushed herself to the edge of her limits, and she was fading fast. Lay noticed that the Darkwood staff was no longer singing, and that the face was again frozen in wood.